Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of children whose bodies I saw turn into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me, for all eternity, of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God, my soul, and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. These powerful words were introduced to me in the 7th grade when I was actually introduced to Holocaust literature and actually the history of the Holocaust, and the book Night, where the quote I just read you is from. It is authored by Elie Wiesel. Holocaust literature is very interesting and has a vast number of genres. But here are just a few. Autobiographies, memoirs, poetries, non-historical journals and diaries, and even fiction are included within the context of Holocaust literature. But let's explore each genre a little more into depth. I will begin with memoirs. Then I will go into non-historical journals and diaries, and finally I will end with postmodern fiction. The first genre I'm going to talk about is, again, memoirs. And memoirs include first-hand accounts, and it's basically exactly what it states. It's a memory, which include vivid and sometimes graphic details in this case, especially with the Holocaust, with Holocaust history. Sometimes very graphic details into what many people had to do when they were either imprisoned or what they had to endure during work labor camps. And Elie Wiesel's work is actually a prime example of a memoir because he writes it very vividly, like a memory. And I'm just going to go ahead and give you a little background into his work. Elie Wiesel is a writer, professor, political activist, and most importantly, a Holocaust educator. And I believe that's why he started to write books in the first place, because he didn't want people to forget what happened and what he had to endure during the Holocaust. This is just one of 57 books that he has published, but this book in particular highlights his experiences as a prisoner in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, Buna, and Buchenwald. After this book was published, he was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which is just several things that he's been awarded. He also was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, an honorary knighthood, and he has over 19 doctorate degrees. But again, his book highlights very graphically what he had to go through. He lost both his parents and his younger sister to Spora. He highlights how he was when he went before the war happened and after it happened, and it's well worth a read. So if you get the chance, I invite you to explore this book and actually read it. The next genre that I'm going to talk about is non-historical journals turned historical accounts of the Holocaust, which include diaries, journals, and even poetry. But the example I'm going to go ahead and give, I'm pretty sure almost everyone has heard of, and that's the Diary of Anne Frank. What's interesting about this genre is the fact that it was never meant to be published in the first place, yet it provides the most accurate and historical accounts into what we as a world have towards validating the events that happened in the Holocaust. So I'm pretty sure if you guys heard of Anne Frank, you're probably pretty familiar with her story, but I'm going to go ahead and give you a little background into her story. Anne Frank was a preteen girl. She was 15 when she passed away. And the diary, when she wrote in it, chronicles most of her life from 1942 to 1944. And her diary highlights wartime and her family hiding in Amsterdam. She had to hide, obviously, from the Nazis, and her family had to hide, and they were caught, and she ended up being imprisoned to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where her sister died, and then she died, and it's speculated she died of typhus. But her diary was found and published by the only survivor of her family, which was her father, and published it after she passed away. So she's probably the most discussed Jewish victims of the Holocaust, yet she never knew that. And her work is also well worth a read. She was incredibly intelligent, and she was very inquisitive about the world around her, despite what she was going through. And the last genre I'm going to talk about is postmodern fiction and its many issues. So, postmodern fiction isn't real. Postmodern meaning that it happened after the war happened. So, postmodern fiction, again, it's basically not real and it happened after the Holocaust occurred. One of the many examples is a story called Maus. It's a graphic novel by Art Spiegelman. He's a cartoonist, actually, which depicts him interviewing his father about his experiences as a Jew and Holocaust survivor. But it's also written not as a story. It's almost written like a comic book if you actually look inside it. The book uses many techniques to make it postmodern and fictional, which Spiegelman does by using animals to highlight races of people. So the Jews are mice, the German Nazis are cats, and the non-Jewish people are actually pigs. So it's very hard to explain, but he writes his story through his father's eyes and what had actually occurred with animals in a comic book form. It's very, very interesting to read. There is a little truth to it, but again, it's not his father's words. His father's first-hand account of what happened. It's just being told through his father's, I guess, through his interpretation, through his interpretation. And Maus can be considered, like, I guess it can qualify under a lot of genres, memoirs, biographies, history, fiction, autobiographies. I mean, just a mix of genres that he can fall under, but he's actually more famous for postmodern fiction. It's actually was well received by many. It became the first graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. But the problem with postmodern fiction is that it isn't really needed, because, I mean, when you think about it, it's just a real rendered down, I guess, artistic interpretation into what really happened that occurred, but it's not real. Again, when you actually see pictures of the Holocaust and you read stories such as Anne Frank and Night, it's a completely different tone than Maus provides with animals and cartoon renditions. It's completely different. There is a lot of concern with survivors and their criticism. An Atlantic article highlights many survivors' concerns with postmodern fiction. One of the quotes says that Maus lacks truth and validity to an era that was all too real in its horror. Fiction is too toned down for the horror, killings, and brutality that really is the Holocaust. And another survivor said it's only a conceived fantasy that does not resonate with the truth and horror that the Holocaust and its victims, such as myself, had to endure. And well, again, while fiction may begin as an artistic interpretation of the Holocaust, and it has good intent with its message, it lacks details that Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel both had to endure in their actual lives while being imprisoned and tortured through the Holocaust. So guys, I hope you guys have a better understanding of Holocaust literature, its significance, and what it entails. It's important to not forget that the events included are actually very real events and they deserve respect. Otherwise, many of the victims would die in vain. I mean, they died in vain. While fiction can be one interpretation of the Holocaust and its events, it's nothing compared to the real-world accounts that Wiesel and Frank actually lived through. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Anne Frank, who said it best. "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death." Holocaust literature may highlight the horrific events, murders, and torture that many had to endure, yet still offers and resonates the virtuous, rare human ability to overcome and see well out of an event that destroyed millions of lives. It offers rays of hope, truth, and knowledge into what once was and how it ultimately was defeated and destroyed, in remembrance of its victims and survivors' words.